The story of the Battle of Village Creek does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the halls of power of a young, struggling nation and in the mind of its second president, a man whose vision for a Texas empire was predicated on the removal of its first peoples. When Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar took office in December 1838, he inherited a republic in a precarious state. The vast territory of Texas was recognized as independent only by the United States. Mexico, its former ruler, still threatened reconquest. The treasury was empty, and the paper currency, known as redbacks, was severely depreciated. Lamar, a poet and a soldier, was also a man of grand, almost visionary ambition. He opposed annexation to the United States, dreaming instead of a great Texan empire that would stretch to the Pacific Ocean. To achieve this, he needed to promote wealth, attract talent, and lay the foundations for what he called higher institutions for moral and mental culture. However, these lofty goals were built upon a brutal and pragmatic foundation. Lamar's administration quickly identified the republic's most valuable and most contested asset: land. The realization of his imperial dreams required capital, European recognition, and a stable population of white settlers. The primary obstacle to all three, in his view, was the presence of numerous Native American tribes occupying vast tracts of desirable territory. Lamar's Indian policy was therefore not an incidental aspect of his administration, but the central pillar upon which his entire state-building strategy rested. The removal of the tribes was the necessary first step to unlock the land's value, which could then be used to attract immigrants, secure loans, and fund his government. The violence that followed was not an unfortunate byproduct of expansion, it was the mechanism of expansion itself. Lamar's approach marked a stark and violent departure from that of his predecessor, Sam Houston. Houston had spent years living among the Cherokees, had a Cherokee wife for a time, and pursued a policy of conciliation and negotiation. He had even negotiated a treaty to set aside a large reservation in East Texas, though the Texas Congress, reflecting the growing sentiment of the white populace, refused to ratify it. By the time Lamar became president, most white Texans had grown weary of the persistent frontier conflict and readily agreed with his view that peaceful coexistence was impossible. Lamar substituted Houston's conciliatory policy with one of sternness and force. He believed that the Native American tribes were an existential threat, potentially allying with Mexico to overthrow the republic. His solution was simple and absolute. In his first formal address to the Texas Congress on December 20th, 1838, he urged that the Cherokee and Comanche tribes be driven from their lands, even if they had to be destroyed. Lamar's public addresses and letters reveal a chillingly clear and consistent ideology. He framed the conflict not as a dispute over land, but as a war of civilization against savagery, of mercy against barbarism. He argued that the white man's forbearance had been misinterpreted as weakness, encouraging what he termed rapacity and slaughter. In a message to the Texas Congress on December 20th, 1838, he laid out his justification for a war without compromise. The first major test of Lamar's policy came in the summer of 1839. Despite pleas from Cherokee chiefs like Duwally, also known as Chief Bowles, for time to gather their crops before leaving in peace, Lamar would not wait. He ordered Secretary of War Albert Sidney Johnston and General Thomas J. Rusk to drive them from Texas. In July, a force of 500 Texan troops attacked a Cherokee settlement near the Neches River. The ensuing Battle of the Neches was a lopsided engagement. The Cherokees and their allies were defeated, and in the fighting, the elderly Chief Bowles, carrying a sword gifted to him by his friend Sam Houston, was shot and killed. The Texan forces then burned the Cherokee villages and farms, destroying their homes and crops, and pursued the survivors, forcing them across the Red River into Indian territory. The Cherokee War was a brutal success for Lamar's administration. It effectively cleared East Texas from its established Cherokee population, and its survivors became refugees. Many of these displaced peoples, seeking a new home, would migrate west, eventually finding a temporary sanctuary in a community of other displaced tribes along the banks of a stream that would come to be known as Village Creek. By the spring of 1841, Lamar's policy of removal had pushed the frontier of conflict westward. The Red River counties of North Texas had become a volatile region of escalating tension, a place where the inexorable advance of Anglo-American settlement met the desperate resistance of native peoples fighting for their lands and survival. This simmering conflict needed only a spark to erupt into open warfare. The Republic of Texas was actively encouraging settlement in these newly claimed territories. An act passed on January 4, 1841, offered hundreds of acres of land to each free white person who emigrated to Texas. Contracts like the one made with W.S. Peters were designed to settle hundreds of families in a vast area that included what would become Tarrant County. For the native tribes who had long used this area as their home and hunting grounds, this influx of surveyors and settlers was an invasion. Responding to the encroachment on their lands, warriors from various tribes, including the K'iche' living along Village Creek, conducted raids on settlements in Fanning, Titus, Bowie, and Lamar counties in late 1840 and the spring of 1841. This cycle of violence created an atmosphere of fear and animosity, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation. That confrontation was triggered by a single horrific event that galvanized settler opinion and provided the immediate justification for a large-scale punitive expedition. On April 10, 1841, while farmer Ambrose Ripley was away from his homestead in what was then Red River County, a band of Native Americans attacked. They first killed his eldest son, who was plowing a field. The family heard the shot and saw the warriors rushing the house. Mrs. Ripley and 5 of her children were killed as they tried to flee. An infant died when the attackers burned the house to the ground. Only 1 or 2 of the daughters managed to escape to a neighboring farm. News of the massacre spread quickly through the frontier settlements, causing widespread outrage and public outcry. The brutal attack on the Ripley family became a rallying point, solidifying support for Lamar's aggressive policies and creating an overwhelming demand for retribution. The target of this retribution would be the large multi-tribal settlement on Village Creek, which settlers believed was the source of these raids. The man tasked with leading this expedition was Brigadier General Edward H. Tarrant, a figure who embodied the Texas frontier. Born in the Carolinas around 1796, Tarrant was a veteran of the War of 1812, having fought under Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. After the war, he moved to Tennessee, where he served as a colonel of the local militia and as a county sheriff before migrating to Texas in 1835. In Texas, Tarrant quickly became a prominent figure. He served in the Republic's Congress, was Chief Justice of Red River County, and established himself as a prosperous planter and slaveholder. He resigned his seat in Congress in 1837, believing he could better serve the Republic by directing ranger activities against the Indians. In 1839, he was elected Brigadier General of the 4th Brigade of the Texas Militia, a force of citizen soldiers responsible for defending the northeastern frontier. Tarrant was a seasoned and respected leader, known for his role in pacifying the frontier to make it safe for Anglo settlement. The expedition to Village Creek would become the culminating event of his Indian fighting career. On May 14, 1841, about 70 men gathered at Fort Johnston in the Red River country to form the punitive expedition. This was not a professional army. They were volunteers, minutemen, or rangers who answered the call to arms, leaving their farms and families behind. They were clad not in uniforms, but in homespun clothes or buckskins, and they provided their own horses and weapons, mostly Kentucky long rifles, shotguns, and pistols. They were motivated by a potent combination of fear, a desire for revenge for attacks like the Ripley Massacre, and the powerful incentive of securing the land for themselves and their families. They elected their own officers, and with General Tarrant at their head, they rode west into territory few of them had ever seen. While the Texans' militia saw their destination as a nest of horrible savages and a depot for stolen horses, the reality of the community on Village Creek was far more complex. It was not a traditional tribal village, but a unique and sprawling multicultural settlement, a final sanctuary for peoples displaced by decades of relentless westward expansion. It was, in effect, a refugee metropolis. The collection of villages that stretched for miles along the creek was home to an extraordinary diversity of Native American groups. Eyewitness accounts from the Texans themselves list Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Seminole, Walk.
The collection of villages that stretched for miles along the creek was home to an extraordinary diversity of Native American groups. eyewitness accounts from the Texans themselves list Cherokee, Muskogee or Creek, Seminole, Waco, Caddo, Kickapoo, Tonkawa, Wichita, Shawnee, and Anadarko peoples. This was not a long-standing tribal alliance, but a recent convergence born of desperation. Many of the inhabitants were survivors of previous violent removals. The Cherokees had been driven from East Texas just 2 years prior during Lamar's 1839 campaign. The Caddo had been systematically pushed out of their ancestral homelands in Louisiana and Arkansas by the United States Indian removal policies, codified in an 1835 treaty that forced them to leave American territory. Other groups like the Muskogee or Creek and Seminole were fragments of nations shattered by the Trail of Tears and other conflicts in the American Southeast. Having been uprooted time and again, they had moved west to the Texas frontier, seeking a place where they could regroup and establish a permanent home. Far from being a temporary camp of nomadic raiders, the Village Creek community was a large, settled, and sophisticated society. The Texans who attacked it were struck by its scale and permanence. They counted 225 occupied lodges and noted that the villages were continuous for over a mile and a half. This was a substantial population center with an estimated 1,000 warriors, though perhaps only half were present at the time of the attack, the rest being away on a buffalo hunt. The community was deeply invested in agriculture. The Texans found roughly 300 acres of corn under cultivation, a clear sign of a society planning for the future. They were also well equipped. The militia discovered not just all manner of farming utensils of the best quality, but also a blacksmith shop, indicating a capacity for manufacturing and repair. They were well armed with good quality guns and were molding their own bullets with a large supply of powder and lead stored in their lodges. This was not a rude city of the wilderness, but a thriving, self-sufficient community determined to defend itself. For the diverse peoples gathered there, Village Creek represented their last best hope. The location, nestled within the dense woodlands of the cross timbers and along a major tributary of the Trinity River, was strategic. It served as a formidable stronghold, providing a defense against both the encroaching white settlers from the east and their traditional rivals, the Comanche, from the west. It was a place where they could raise their families, plant their crops, and organize a collective resistance to the forces that had relentlessly driven them across the continent. To the government of the Republic of Texas, however, this concentration of native power was an intolerable threat. In the language of the Texan reports, it was the home of the horrible savages who have murdered our families and the central depot for the stolen horses from our frontier. The very existence of this sanctuary, a symbol of native resilience and defiance, made its destruction an inevitable objective of Lamar's policy of removal. The attack on Village Creek was not just a raid on a hostile camp, it was an assault on a community of displaced persons who had nowhere left to run.
On the morning of May 24, 1841, after nearly 10 days on the march, General Tarrant's small force of volunteers finally closed in on their target. The ensuing conflict would be a chaotic, running gunfight that would expose the Texans' tactical vulnerability while ultimately achieving their strategic goal of destroying the last great Native American sanctuary in North Texas. After days of tracking through the cross timbers and finding only deserted villages, Tarrant's expedition captured a lone Native American man who, under duress, revealed the precise location of the occupied settlements along Village Creek. A scouting party of 6 men, led by the veteran frontiersman Captain Henry Stout, rode ahead to reconnoiter. Peering through the dense brush from a rise overlooking the creek, they saw the first signs of life. A woman tending a fire by a copper kettle, with lodges visible in the trees beyond. For the first time, a Texan force had located an active native village in the region without being detected first. Stout sent a rider back to bring up the main column. As the 69 volunteers gathered behind a thicket a few hundred yards from the village, Tarrant prepared his men for the assault. Knowing the danger ahead, he gave a brief, grim address. With the order given, the militia charged across the open prairie toward the southernmost huts. The attack was a complete surprise. The inhabitants, as one report stated, scarcely had time to leave their lodges before the Texans were upon them. Several were shot as they tried to escape. The two women first spotted by the creek screamed and fled into the creek bed. One was shot and killed by a militiaman who claimed he mistook her for a warrior, while the other woman and her child were captured. The first village was taken in an instant. Discovering a large trail leading north along the creek, the main body of the Texan force spurred their horses in pursuit, leaving a small guard behind. 2 miles on, they burst upon a second, larger village, which was also quickly overrun. As the alarm spread, native resistance began to stiffen. The battle devolved from a coordinated charge into a chaotic, running gunfight. The villages were so numerous and close together that one Texan described it as one continuous village for the distance of 1.5 miles. The Texans became scattered, with small parties engaging warriors who used the dense thickets and creek banks for cover. General Tarrant, concerned by how dispersed his men had become, ordered them to regroup at the second village. It was here that a fateful decision was made. Despite the clear evidence of a large and now alerted enemy force, Captain John B. Denton obtained Tarrant's reluctant permission to lead a small scouting party further down the creek, promising to avoid an ambush. Denton and Captain James Borland each took about 10 men and proceeded down separate trails that eventually converged near a horseshoe bend in the creek, a natural kill zone. As the combined scouting party advanced into the dense woods along the creek bed, they rode directly into a trap. A volley of gunfire erupted from an unseen enemy hidden in the thickets on all sides. Captain Henry Stout at the front was hit in the arm, and his clothes were pierced by several other bullets. He was also struck in the leg by an arrow with a flint head, which embedded itself so deeply he could not pull it out. Immediately behind him, John B. Denton was struck simultaneously. Wounded in the arm, shoulder, and chest, he wheeled his horse around but fell from the saddle, dead, as he reached the top of the creek bank. The sudden, overwhelming fire sent the surviving scouts scrambling back in a full retreat. The Texans had been decisively routed. The death of the charismatic fighting parson and the ferocity of the ambush brought the reality of their situation into sharp focus for General Tarrant. From a captured prisoner, he learned that the villages were home to upwards of 1,000 warriors. His small force of fewer than 70 men was dangerously outnumbered. Realizing that if the native warriors organized a counterattack, his command could be annihilated, Tarrant made the prudent decision to withdraw. He dispatched a party of 24 men under Captain Borland to recover Denton's body, which they found undisturbed. At 5 p.m., the expedition began its retreat, carrying their dead commander tied across a horse. They took with them what plunder they could manage: 37 horses, 6 head of cattle, and a significant quantity of lead, powder, guns, and other supplies from the villages. They marched 12 miles that night before making camp. The next morning, they buried John B. Denton's body in an unmarked grave beside a creek, and 5 days later, the diminished company arrived back in the settlements. The battle was, in tactical terms, a failure for the Texans. They had been ambushed, their celebrated captain killed, and they were forced into a hasty retreat. Yet, in the broader context of Lamar's campaign of removal, the raid was a stunning strategic success. It had proven that even this formidable sanctuary was not secure from Texan attack. The psychological blow was decisive. The Battle of Village Creek had broken the last major Native American stronghold in North Texas. The smoke from the Battle of Village Creek had barely cleared before its consequences began to reshape the map of North Texas. The engagement, though brief, set in motion a chain of events that led directly to the final removal of the region's tribes, the establishment of a permanent military presence, and the founding of a city that would come to define the American West. The attack on May 24, 1841, shattered the security of the Village Creek Sanctuary. The inhabitants, realizing their homes were no longer safe, abandoned their extensive villages, fields, and many of their possessions.